boy, are the cracks really starting to show. So, we are going to talk about Marvel. We're going to talk about the MCU. Specifically, we're going to talk about their approach to streaming shows, which is getting a complete overhaul because they seem to have woken up to the fact that the way they've been doing it has not been working out very well. So there has been news that is broke, some of which the information is pretty well confirmed, the other of which it not 100%, but it fits and would make sense. So while I am going to be doing an overall analysis of what has been learned, take a certain amount of it with a grain of salt, at least when it comes to the specifics. But the overall tone of the thing, yeah, this is something that's happening. So on the back of news, this kind of kicked the whole thing off that Daredevil Born Again is effectively getting a reset. That's the revival of Daredevil that's coming out on Disney+. That had about half its season shot before strikes shut the whole thing down. And apparently, during the strike, some of the executives, such as Kevin Feige and others, took a look at what had been shot and realized, oh, no, this isn't working. We need to not leap right back into production once all the strikes are fully wrapped up. We need to actually stop and reassess and figure out what we need to do. And whether or not that specifically set off the move to completely revamp the entire approach to how they're handling streaming, or if they were already considering revamping all that and the timing of them doing that made them look at Daredevil again, and just the news of the Daredevil reset broke a little sooner than the news of the full overhaul of how they're approaching it, it's hard to know. But they happen pretty quickly together. So before we can understand and appreciate how it is that things are changing, we need to understand some of the quirks of how they've been done up to this point. Now, some of these quirks are inherent to streaming services, many of which aren't doing things in the manner that a traditional TV show would, especially ones who do the binging model where the entire thing is dropped pretty much all at once. And that hasn't really been the case for Disney Plus in particular, but there is, again, just some inherent notions to how streaming has largely been handled, but then there are a lot of the specifics for how Marvel has chosen to go about this. The short version is that there haven't really been proper showrunners up to this point. The way traditionally a show, whether it be streaming and especially on television, be it cable or network, the way things normally work is you hire a showrunner who is also generally the head writer, not 100% of the time, but usually your head writer is also your showrunner, and they put together a pilot episode, assuming that it isn't ordered straight to series, which does still happen even on the traditional television formats. But they also come up with a show Bible so that anyone who is working on subsequent episodes, because the showrunner's not going to write everything, they have a guide for what is or is not allowed to do with certain characters, certain directions, what plot points need to happen, at what point in the season, etc. Marvel hasn't been doing that. They haven't had showrunners. In fact, there are reports of some cases where the head writers of some of these shows have either quit or been squeezed out. This is some of the stuff where the specifics are a little bit muddy and not completely confirmed, but some of the news that is coming forward is, for instance, Jeremy Slater, who was the head writer on Moon Knight, appears to have quit, or at the very least, he's not coming back to do anymore. He has started working with James Gunn over in the DC stuff. And then there's Jessica Gao, who was the head writer for She-Hulk, and she was supposedly completely sidelined during production, although she may have been brought back in to help with some of the post-production. But the overall thing is, the normal process is to have a showrunner who is effectively handling the creative overarching. You'll still have producers handling the logistical overarching production, but there wasn't a creative head for most of these shows, or possibly any of them, depending on how you want to look at it. But what appears to have happened in most, if not all of the cases of the MCU Disney Plus shows is that scripts were turned in and then writers were shut out. Now, you might think, okay, so the directors then picked up the reins and handled the thing moving forward. Well, Potentially to a certain degree, but it really doesn't seem to have panned out that way. Because as a rule of thumb, directors of individual episodes of a show, unless the same director is directing every single one, then generally they're not taking creative control either. They're coming in to get a script, to get general guidelines, from honestly, they take a lot of the cues from the existing production staff, the actors, the costumers, and whatnot, who say, okay, this is how my character is like, or these are the costumes that have already been approved for these characters, and the director just works with what they have. They don't take over creative control. And similarly with editors, they just work with what they're given. And so basically, the executives were running the shows. Now, shows will have executive oversight to varying degrees, and that's true of pretty much every format, be it television, cable, or streaming. But the executives don't usually run the thing. And that seems to have been the case, not necessarily by design, but definitely by default, if nothing else. A big part of the overarching problem appears to have been the fact that since the ousting of Ike Perlmutter, that basically resulted in the dissolution of the entire Marvel TV production end. And so the streaming shows, they didn't really have dedicated TV producers or executives. They were just being worked on by people who were ported in from the movie department and were like working on shows on like a one-off basis. So these things weren't even being approached the way you would approach a TV show. They were being handled largely like movies, where the script gets turned in, you shoot it, and if anything went wrong, you fix it in post. And yes, the fix it in post mentality, which also has not really been working out for not just MCU, but movies in general lately. Fix it in post is actually causing a lot of problems, but especially with a TV show, which is longer more often than not than a movie, is to come in with that movie mentality of we have a script, we shoot it, and we'll fix it afterwards if we have to. One of the advantages of TV normally is that you can fix it as you go, and this format has not allowed for that in any way, shape, or form. And when you bring in people from the movie side to run a TV show, they don't understand the fundamental differences of production. And so they've been handling it like you'd handle a movie, and that has not worked out well. Another thing probably exacerbating this is over the last few years, Marvel has been bringing in outside executives as opposed to doing what they used to do, which was to take high-end creative people and promoting them up to executive level. That happened with folks like, say, Jon Favreau, who served as an executive producer for quite a few movies that he did not direct while he was still working with the MCU. But anyways, that's some of what has been going on and what has caused some of the hiccups that have happened. So what are they now going to do? Well, they are intending to structure it more like a traditional TV show, where you get a showrunner, where it is their job to shepherd the show as a whole from creation and scripting through to completion, as opposed to compartmentalizing everything the way that they've been doing up to this point. They are intending to have those showrunners come up with a Bible for the show and to do a pilot, and then for that pilot to be reviewed and approved so that they know what the end result is going to be, as opposed to treating it like a movie where you either green light it, whether you know it's going to work or not, and just hope it does. Instead, they're going to go back to a more traditional TV thing. So like, okay, give us a pilot episode so we can see it and make sure it works. Then we give you the money to start working on the rest of the thing. So they're going to start doing that. There is the intention to create a TV-specific executive, so they're not bouncing back and forth between movies and television anymore. So that's also a good thing. Like, don't get me wrong, when they ousted Ike Perlmutter, that was a good thing. If you don't remember this guy, Ike Perlmutter was head of Marvel Entertainment for a while, until basically Kevin Feige complained about him so much that they got rid of him. And the guy wasn't good. He was the reason that Rhodey got recast, literally because he made the argument no one's going to notice anyway, which, okay. And he was the one who was really heavily pushing the Inhumans. He was the one who supposedly was minimizing the impact of the women characters and was putting the kibosh on a Black Widow movie, because in his mind, the toys of a woman superhero wouldn't sell as well. So like, the guy was a jerk, and I'm glad he's gone. But the problem was, when they got rid of him and just put everything that was the MCU under Feige, that sounded good, except the guy's a movie producer and his team are movie producers. And so they tried to handle the streaming like it was movies, and It's not. So reestablishing a dedicated team of, at the very least, executives, if not working your way down and building an entire pipeline, at the very least, having executives whose only job is to handle television and who aren't having to worry about, well, TV, movie, okay, wait, do I do it differently each time? Do I do it basically the same either way, regardless of the format different? Like, we're scrapping all that. Dedicated people. That's good. They should have done that in the first place. Another consequence is that future shows are no longer being planned as limited miniseries, but instead are going to be approached as something to have additional seasons in the future, which is another thing that hasn't been the case. Loki has honestly been the exception, and while there's been some word that other shows might get follow-ups or second seasons, they haven't been designed with that in mind, even the ones that ended effectively on cliffhangers like Moon Knight did, with the story completely unresolved and no commitment to coming back and doing more. But that isn't necessarily in and of itself the problem. But again, I think that was probably a result of them treating it like movies, trying to treat each series like a one-off, the way you would normally more or less treat the movies. And again, that's not really the way that TV, even streaming TV, generally works. Now, does that mean everything will automatically get a second season? No, but you format a thing differently when you're trying to hook people in with the intention of keeping them coming back season after season than you do when you think this is a one and done and your primary mandate is to set up puzzle pieces and load the basis for a future movie, which is what things like Ms. Marvel really felt like. It felt much more about setting up what would eventually be the Marvels, which is not out yet and won't be for a little bit at time of recording, but that and indicating a start for the X-Men in some way. Ultimately, that seemed to be more of the ultimate purpose of that, is to cover the base for where this character comes from, and it's not worried about whether or not you want to see a second season, because they're not going to do one anyway. And so again, the fact that they've been doing them as one-offs has fundamentally hampered the way they've been approached. Now, again, some of these have been handled better than others. As much as I did not like the ending of WandaVision, as an overall thing, that was handled a bit better. As much as the handling of the villains, especially in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, is not very good, that is, honestly, at least structurally and formatted, probably one of the best that they've done. Again, the thing's got problems, do not get me wrong, but as far as where it fits into everything, that was a case of, okay, so we're going to cover Sam coming to grips with the idea that he's going to be Captain America. Now, you could, in theory, skip this and just go to the next Captain America movie where it is him, and for you, it just leaps off from the end of Endgame, where he takes the shield and, oh, okay, so he's Captain America now. But if you want to see the journey of how he got comfortable assuming that role, here's this show. The show wasn't perfect and it had some serious issues, but like that kind of format seemed to work. But there is a difference between having a one-off series that kind of fills in a gap that is kind of optional and doing something that is just straight up loading the basis for something else and doesn't feel like it is constructed to actually hook you in and make you love these characters and make you want to come back for them. Supposedly also they're going to be putting a lot more character focus on this, which again is intended to minimize the feeling that these are, well, homework, that you're watching it because if you don't watch this, you won't understand the MCU stuff you actually care about. So there is already kind of that, because we'll see how the Marvels turns out as a film, but I'm really worried about that one because right now, from the look of it, it has the look and feel of something that if you did not watch WandaVision, if you did not watch Ms. Marvel, Lord help you, if you didn't see Secret Invasion, then you're not going to understand what's going on with 3 out of 4 members of the core cast. Whether or not that ends up being the case fully, we'll know when the movie comes out, but that's definitely a risk right now. And so these shows were very much feeling like homework as opposed to a product intended to entertain. They now appear to have realized why that's bad and are attempting to fix it. Whether or not they will, we'll see. If I'm being completely honest, Marvel really is heading for a situation that is kind of what DC's been dealing with since the Snyderverse kind of imploded in on itself. Now, granted, there were additional exacerbating factors with this. Snyder stepping away from Justice League partly because of a family tragedy, amongst other things. But it was very clear the studio had lost confidence in his vision at that point anyway. But that is that as these things have gone on, there's been a lack of central creative vision and really just a vision of producers. Now, why has Marvel lasted so much longer than DC, especially considering that they started sooner and theoretically should have hit the road bump sooner? Well, honestly, part of it is luck. And also part of it is DC was trying to speed run what Marvel was doing, which just made them prone to hitting the speed bumps a lot harder, if not sooner. But Marvel got lucky in a number of ways. When you actually look back and realize how long this has gone on, they flat out lucked out. And I think that luck is running out. Let me explain what I mean by they got lucky. Part of the thing with Marvel right now is, as I said, this is not really creative driven. This is producer driven. This is Kevin Feige's MCU much more than it is anybody else's. Now, that hasn't always been the case, but the times when it hasn't been the case have been relatively short-lived or sort of a little bit, not flukes, but exceptions. Honestly, you look at the creators that were brought into the original batch of films for the MCU. You had folks like Jon Favreau, a talented creative person, not really known as a visionary, though, as a director. You had people like Louis Leterrier, kind of the same thing. Kenneth Branagh, arguably a bit more of a singular vision as a director, though of varying results. Joe Johnston, bit of a workman, if we're being honest. Like, he fit because he'd done stuff like The Rocketeer, which was evoking the same kind of era that Captain America: The First Avenger was. But again, not a ton of excessively strong directorial or creative voices. Now, when they brought in Joss Whedon to do the original Avengers, and yes, I know, we all hate Joss Whedon now. I've got my own issues with him. There's the last video I did on him. So I'm not doing this to praise him. I'm just talking about the impact on the overall thing. He came in with a much clearer creative voice. Whether you like that voice or not is a separate issue, but he definitely had one. But by the time he finished Age of Ultron, he bowed out because he was feeling the hand of the executives over him who wanted to dictate what he was doing, and he felt like he couldn't be creative anymore. And after that, that's where they got really lucky. They got really lucky with the Russo brothers. Because if you look at the filmographies of a lot of these directors that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has brought in, not all of them, but a fairly decent amount of them are either relatively new and only have a couple films under their belts, or they have more experience in television than in film. Now, in a way, that's very beneficial because I kind of mentioned before, directors from television aren't used to imposing that strong creative vision because the characters are pre-existing, the world is pre-existing, the costumes, so much stuff is determined before they even get there. So they're used to just taking the pieces that they're given and putting things together in a way that will be entertaining and consistent with what's come before. And that is a skill that a TV director needs to have, and that was a skill that Marvel needed some of their MCU directors to have. And when I say they got lucky with the Russo brothers, here's the thing. The Russo brothers, you can argue, don't have particularly strong directorial or creative voice, but I would argue that something they are very good at is taking the pieces dictated to them by an executive and forming them into something that works. That is a skill. And it's a skill not everybody has. Just like not everybody has the skill to have a singular creative vision that they are prepared to see through from pre-production all the way to finished release and maintain and fight for their vision all the way through. The Russos give me the impression of not being that kind of directors, but what they are good at is making sure that they get in the notes from the executives, keep them happy, but still come out with a coherent and effective product. That's not an easy thing to do, and it's not something that everybody can do. So they really got lucky that they got in television guys who would take the notes, but also had enough of a strong sense of what it was that was being done to basically keep the train on the tracks. And since they left, you've felt that absence. Now, there have been some instances of creative voices and people with very clear creative focus and their own flair that they've brought to this. You've got James Gunn, you've got Ryan Coogler. But the thing is, even with some of the more interesting or artsy choices that have been made with some of the directors, like, say, Chloe Zhao or Taika Waititi, by and large, these are people who don't have experience directing with something this big, this much money, and this much action. So in a lot of cases, they're only directing about half the movie. They are directing the stuff with the actors having dialogue, but they're handing over all the action to the second unit, which is basically its own thing. Now, second unit is there to film whatever the director themselves aren't filming, and that may or may not include action scenes, depending on whether the director wants to do those things. But in the case of Marvel, we have heard from some people who have opted out of doing a Marvel movie, such as Ava DuVernay, that she wasn't going to be allowed to even learn how to do the action directing. They were just going to hand that off to the second unit, who were going to do it the way they'd always done it, and she would just handle everything else. And that really does hamper what creative people can do, even people with unique, distinct voices. And you've seen that even, honestly, from far earlier. Edgar Wright was supposed to direct an Ant-Man movie before the MCU was even a thing. He'd been working on this. And he ultimately left because he just wasn't feeling like he could deliver the vision he wanted to make. And he was replaced by Peyton Reed, whose filmography is television and rom-coms. Somebody who'll take the notes and do what he can with them. Now, I know it's weird that I've just gone off for a bit about the movies when I started off talking about the streaming, but I'm trying to lay the groundwork here for the mentality of why the MCU as a whole is where it currently is, and how we got into the situation where the streaming situation ended up where it's at. Because even as the MCU continues to, on occasion, bring in some more creative and very talented and unique directorial voices, they have not let them do their own thing very often. James Gunn is the big exception. Ryan Coogler seems to be the second one. Other than that, I mean, Sam Raimi a little bit. He certainly got to put his visual flair all over Multiverse of Madness. How involved he was in the story? Hard to say. So can Marvel right this ship? Maybe. Now, I know there are some people out there who are just going to claim it's superhero fatigue, that actually none of the MCU was ever good and it's just everybody's realizing that. And while I don't think superhero fatigue is invalid, I don't think that's the whole story. The approach that Marvel has been using that worked for as long as it did, partly because they just got really lucky with the people that they lined up, and once Whedon left and the Russo brothers left, the thing has just been ambling along like something being headed by executives as opposed to a central creative force. And Kevin Feige is a very talented producer, and he's been juggling a lot, but he's not a creative force. I don't think he necessarily even thinks he is, but he did seem to think that he could basically sideline the creative forces, bring them in for, the script, get a decent director, but like so many parts of this has just been taken out of the hands of the creatives. And honestly, a lot of it is felt like AI. And in fact, in Secret Invasion, the opening credits literally were created by AI. And this is the kind of stuff that the strike has been all about. Both strikes, the writer strike, which at time of recording has resolved, the SAG strike, which at time of recording has not resolved yet. We'll see what happens by the time this comes out. But this mentality of, okay, we can automate a lot of this. Whether or not AI has literally been used in the MCU other than those opening credits of Secret Invasion, probably not. I don't think so. But the mentality that leads executives to think AI is a good idea has been in place. The modular format. We have our second unit. They handle all the action. So when we bring in writers, they hand us a script and they go away. And they've been doing the streaming shows like that, even though normally on streaming, you get a showrunner who is also a writer who shepherds the thing all the way through, and they just haven't done it. And they bring in director, okay, shoot the script that has been approved and the action scenes are already taken care of, go. So how much of a flair the director's going to be able to put on things is going to be limited. because they have sectioned off and made into modules all these different aspects. Pre-production is basically completely handled on its own, almost separate from the creatives, because they have whatever supposed overarching plan then they're currently working towards. I think it's Secret Wars. And as they head that way, a lot of decisions are going to be made either before a director is even brought on board, or made that in a way that the director doesn't really get to change, even if the movie they would like to make would be something else. So that mentality, which is an executive mentality, has been driving Marvel for a while, and their luck has run out. They've been making these movies, these shows, this universe unsustainably. And it lasted, I feel personally, quite strongly through Endgame. But since then, you've seen it start to veer off the rails. And I'm going to argue that it's the lack of a clear creative controlling force. That hasn't been there for the product as a whole, and that really hasn't been there for most of the individual shows that have gone out on streaming. Now, at time of talking and recording, there's no word on whether a similar overhaul of Star Wars might be in the mix. That might happen. That might not. They do have Dave Filoni, who seems to be acting as the primary creative force. So they do have one over with the Star Wars streaming stuff, but they've still been doing the whole bunch of limited series thing. There is The Mandalorian, which has gotten multiple seasons, and Andor is going to get 2, but that is effectively still a limited series because they knew coming in they were only going to do 2 seasons, and they knew the format of them. So I wouldn't be shocked if there is also some restructuring over on the Star Wars end, but it might not have to be as drastic because, again, they did have people like Dave Filoni who were only handling the streaming stuff, and the movies were being handled completely separately. So Star Wars is probably in a better position, but I wouldn't be shocked if we see a dialing back of the limited series that aren't intended to continue any further, especially if this shift in Marvel proves to be more effective. But ultimately, this is also dovetailing and bumping up against the potential bursting of the streaming bubble because, yeah, streaming's a bubble and has been for a while. Here's the thing. None of these streaming services, not Disney Plus, not Max, not Paramount Plus, not Peacock, none of these are profitable. The amount of money that they have to sink in just to build the infrastructure, just to be able to store all these shows and have them be accessed and be able to be streamed at a decent rate enough to be shown on people's TV when it streams to their television, that infrastructure alone is massively expensive. And then these places, because they're not Netflix, or at least Netflix back in the day where they can just hoard everything, they might have a lot of stuff in their back catalog. Disney certainly had that going for them. But the expectation is to keep people on, you have to keep making new stuff. And they're making new series at the cost of a big budget movie a piece. Like they're spending upwards of $150 million on these series. But how much revenue is that generating? That is literally impossible to say because you don't know how many people signed up for your service on the basis of that show coming out, or on the basis of that made-for-streaming movie that you made, or who are sticking around and not canceling their subscription because you have made more MCU stuff. It is their belief that that is the case, but they can't really quantify that. They can look at the streaming numbers and the viewing numbers, but how many of those are people watching because I'm already here and have the subscription, and how many people actively chose to come here because of that? That's really hard to quantify. And more to the point, because these things don't make money each time they're run the way things on traditional television did because they would bring in the ad revenue, nor is there the rental service like Blockbuster back in the day where they get money every time somebody rents it. They're just throwing money in a hole. That's what streaming has become. It's become a money pit for pretty much everything that isn't Netflix. Now, Netflix is technically profitable in terms of they are making more than they are spending, but don't think that they're off the hook because they have mountains of debt that they ran up to build what they became. Now they're chugging along because I said they are at least profitable, but they're not in that much of a stabler position than anybody else. Streaming does not bring in what the old formats brought in. It doesn't bring in what network television does, what cable does, what rental of physical media or sale of physical media does. It's honestly kind of the movie pass thing. You pay one thing a month and then you watch as much or as little as you want. But the company only makes that subscription from you per month, regardless of how much or how little you watch. And so figuring out how much revenue each thing is generated is almost impossible because it just isn't set up that way. That's not how it works anymore. I mean, that's a big part of why streaming wasn't giving residuals the way that other formats did. Part of it was difficult to quantify, but also because networks and studios were obfuscating all this and didn't want to pay royalties. The writer's strike resolved that for them. Hopefully it'll resolve for the actors as well. But the streaming models aren't sustainable. They're just not. Because you're just making and throwing money at all these projects, honestly, at this point, just to keep the people you have. Because for the most part, most people who want your service probably have it. Like, you'll get fluctuations. Some people will come, some people will go, but there's only so much you can do to get people to subscribe. Eventually, that levels out of the ceiling. That's also why everything's jacking up in price right now. Now, I'm going to stop this tangent here because this kind of gets into a whole other thing that I might dedicate a whole video onto about the unsustainability of most of these models. Because this dovetails into everything from what Unity pulled to what OnlyFans tried to pull a little while back. The fact that pretty much all these businesses are built on what is initially an unsustainable model, and they know that, and part of the plan down the line, well, either part of the plan or what will eventually become a necessity is to make the service worse and charge more for it. Do less, get paid more, because what you were doing originally didn't actually make you money. It just suckered people in and you're now going to milk them. But again, I feel like if that's a topic I'm going to go any deeper on, I need to dedicate a whole video on it. So I need to stop that there. But Disney, all of them really, are not in great shape when it comes to these streaming services. And the fact that Disney has tied so much of Marvel to the streaming services, even if they can right the ship creatively, which I hope they can do, I have not liked that much of what's come out of the MCU lately. But I want to. I still like most of these properties and characters, and I can go back to earlier parts of this and go, that was good, and I can hope for it to be that again. Can they? Maybe. Creatively. Will it be enough? I don't know, because at a certain point, even if Marvel starts working again creatively so that the viewing numbers go up and the critical response gets back to where it was, there's a lot of other stuff cracking and breaking right now that might force things to change regardless. It's all interconnected. It's all complicated. And no, nobody's going broke because they're woke. They're going broke because they built an unsustainable business model. And unsustainable business models don't sustain. Shock. In any case, what do you think about all this? What do you think about the way Marvel had been handling streaming up to this point? What do you think about the direction they intend to take it? Do you think that it'll be enough? And if you want to throw in your thoughts on the overall problem, like I went off on the last little bit here, yeah, feel free to give me your thoughts on that too. Drop them all down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living. But even if you can't help me out that way, like, share, subscribe, also helpful. Links to other things I do down in the description, but don't worry too much about it. What I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Time to thank some Patreon backers, and in the spirit of October, I'd like to thank Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Goddess Alita, Turok, The Thing That Goes Doink in the Anime, Ruth, Oliver B., Solitary Pictures, Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernobilax the Poodle, Robin Powell, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, and Rosalind Bennett. Thank you for your assistance. I don't know, I might try theming the shoutouts in the future. I don't know, we'll see. Thank you.